Hi, everyone. I'm Troy Swanson. I'm one of the librarians at Moraine Valley, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this panel discussion that is part of our One Book, One College program that's connected to Eve Ewing's book, 1919, which is a book of poetry about the 1919 race riots. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to focus on Eve Ewing's pop culture work. We're going to focus on her comics. She's one of those unique individuals that is a researcher, a novelist, a poet, and she writes comic books. And so, to do our justice with our program, we want to talk about her comics writing because it really is unique, and I think she brings a lot to that medium. So, to do that today, I'm very happy to welcome Adon Alvarado and Ronell Whitaker. And I'd like to ask each of you guys, if you would, to introduce yourselves. Whoever wants to jump first, go ahead, jump in.
Adon, alphabetically, you have to go first.
I'll go. I got you. So I'm Adon Alvarado. I'm an English teacher at Bloom High School in Chicago Heights. I teach American Lit, African American, and Latin American literature there.
Thanks. So. Welcome. Thank you.
I'm Ronell Whitaker, the English Department Curriculum Chair for the South Suburban Chicago District of a bunch of schools, Community High School District 218. It's hard for me every time I have to do these introductions. I have to remember where I work. I've had like 4 different jobs.
Right.
But yeah, no. So I'm like the head of the English department for South Suburban Chicago schools.
Okay. Well, thank you both for joining me. We do appreciate your time and expertise. So, I guess to get us started, let me just ask. Let's learn a little bit about, Eve Ewing and talk about maybe, I don't know if you want to start us with her background, if anyone, any biographical information, like why is Eve Ewing notable within comic books?
Here's what I'll start with, which is wild to me. I had never heard of Eve Ewing before, following her on Twitter. I think back then her name was Wikipedia Brown or something like that. And it was just this is just a cool voice to be aware of. And like most women on that space, when you deign to talk about anything nerdy or make an assertion that something could change, be different in that space, you can get alternately vilified as well as amplified, right? So that's how she kind of got on my radar. And that's, I think I became aware of her when she was kind of making the push for how powerful it would be if we had more people of color who were creators in these spaces, right? And it was so funny because when she got the Ironheart book, there was a bunch of these, I'm realizing that we're on this family thing, so I won't say what I was going to say. There were a bunch of these people of a movement who objected to her getting that book. And they used things like, tokenism and race hire and all that kind of stuff to kind of justify that. Some person even said she only got the job because of her hair. And it was just interesting to kind of have that backdrop with having just started following her and seeing this intelligent, really cool woman who is an amazing poet, and then go, oh, she's about to write a comic book, I'm in.
Right.
And then to find out that this comic, that she's creating as a black girl from the south side of Chicago is bet I'm double in, right? So, I don't know if I can really give biographical, background, but that's how I first became aware of who Eve Ewing was.
Yeah, for me it was, I have been coaching a slam poetry team for my high school for the last 5 years, and we've been competing in the Louder and the Bomb tournament. So just working with YCA, with young Chicago authors, and going through their programs, into their workshops. I just got familiar with just a lot of Haymarket authors in general, Haymarket poets. So then I came across some of her poems through those workshops. Picked up Electric Arches and just kind of fell in love from there. And then when I found out she was writing, both Ronell and I are part of an organization, LitX, that focuses largely on pop culture, but also, we kind of hit the ground running with comic books in the classroom. So when I found out that she was writing a comic book, I was all in from the get-go. To be honest, I did as somebody who does not spend a lot of time on Twitter, I didn't know all the things that were going into it. But now that you're saying it, that's seems to be par for the course. Anytime you bring in some, some dope outside creator into writing this space, people are going to say some, again, to keep it friendly, dumb stuff.
Right. Yeah, she's a great follow on Twitter, and I know I've tweeted out a couple things that we're doing in relation to her book, and she's retweeted it, and I'm always like, yeah, she's retweeted. So she's definitely, interactive and is great. So, you guys mentioned Ironheart, so I think that's probably a great place to start because that's probably her most known work. So, can we talk about Ironheart? Like, what is Ironheart, and why should people read it, maybe, and what does she bring to that book?
Oh man, why should she read it, or why should people read it? I mean, for everything. I mean, I think from just a little bit, like, everybody should read it. But if you're from Chicago, you definitely should read it, because like there just feels like so much of Chicago. Not just the character is from Chicago, but like just in the way that she speaks and the language that she uses. I'm sure it's language that is used, around the country. But just being from Chicago, like when you just see like some of the stuff that she's tossing out there, when she's like leaving a room and she's saying deuces, or when she's calling stuff like whack, or when everything's got that A at the end, it's just nice. I think one that like I think is, and I don't want to put words in Ronell's mouth, but I'm pretty sure like the first time I heard it was actually from Ronell, and then she uses it quite a bit, which is like kick rocks. Right, which is like, she loves using that to like in that thing. So just like I think the language from like just jumping off is like something that you just kind of brings you in, right? It's a language that is not often used in comic books. So that's just from the get-go. When you want to start talking about like the deeper themes that she's bringing into, which I think we'll probably get into, I think there's a lot to talk about. But I do want to let Ronell just jump in on those. On his like initial thoughts.
Maybe Ronell, could you set us like, so who is Ironheart? Like, who is that as a hero?
Yeah, Ironheart is this 15-year-old black girl from the south side of Chicago, who is also a genius. She figures out how to build her own Iron Man suit just from plans that she gets off the black market. That's like the pitch for who she is, right? She wouldn't be a superhero if it weren't for that background of tragedy, and we know that living in this city, there is no shortage of tragedy that often can be visited upon, young black and brown people. So that definitely plays into her story. So she kind of uses that to fuel her own superhero ethos. I mean, it's just a really cool. It's a fun update of that storyline. Like we have to kind of remember, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of these characters are like 50, 60 years old. Batman just hit, like, I think, was it 80 or something like that? Like, yeah. So
39, I think he was born. He was created in 1939.
Yeah, right. So to have like this refresh that feels like a lot newer and a lot more, present, I think was necessary, right? And I think it kind of gets to what Adon was saying. Like, one of the things I treasure the most about this character and Eve Ewing as a writer is like there's an authenticity that comes with what she's doing, right? Like Adon and I have been all around the country talking about comics in the classroom, and one of my favorite characters is Miles Morales, Spider-Man, right? Created by Brian Michael Bendis, and is that who? I think that is right.
Yes.
I'm blanking. Yeah,
it is. Yes.
So, and it's interesting, the story of that creation, right? Miles Morales is an Afro-Latinx kid from Brooklyn, right? And this idea that this, this white guy who, with all the good intentions, and has like, kids who are, I think his kid is black or half black, has a very specific point of view, right? But it took me reading the novelization of Miles Morales' story by Jason Reynolds, written by a black man, that made me go, oh, this is what we get when someone who's actually lived an experience writes a character versus someone who is writing like from the outside, right? There's, of course, no limit to what people can write. I mean, I totally am in that camp, but there's also something that you can maybe sacrifice in authenticity. And the first thing I do when I read Riri. Like, I'm turning pages and I'm like, oh, this is so black. This is so Southside. It's so, like, real. And it was so cool because I think about, like, the kids who I've taught, and I go, like, how amazing would it be for those kids to finally fully see themselves, realize a medium that they're used to it being like a bunch of, white dudes, right? Like, it's just interesting to say, I see myself living in something, and then it goes to a different place. I think Adam was getting there, right? Like, this idea that there are things that she's able to explore because she's grounded and because she's so authentic that will land different than, some 50-year-old guy who's never lived here and is trying to address, gun violence in the city, or who has a different point of view than what Eve Ewing, has, who is notoriously, pro-kid, notoriously pro-education, who has spoken out about how a lot of the violence that we see in our city are a direct result as a lack of resources and not so much the need for more policing, right? So this is a person who's bringing all this stuff to her writing, and it just lends an authenticity to it that we have been missing. And I think Marvel, honestly, and a lot of the other big two, of the big three have done this too, but Marvel has really leaned into hiring some folks that are just outside of the norm, and it's showing up on the page. Like, it's just showing up a lot better in a lot of ways to me.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Bendis, because Bendis is the one who actually made the character Ironheart, but I feel like it's Ewing who has, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, but Ewing has made that character more authentic, right? She's sort of reinvented it from where Bendis put it. Like, it's one thing to have a desire to diversify comics and pop culture, but when it's, like you said, when it's a bunch of, like, middle-aged white guys trying to do it, there's only so far you're gonna go with it, right? And so you've said
there's no one on this planet who would say that character belongs to Bendis.
No, right? Yeah, right. No, yeah, 100%, 100%.
It's cool that you brought that up. It's like she is Ironheart at this point.
Yeah, totally. So I want to. You've said so much. I want to maybe unpack some of this, and maybe look to Adon, because you had mentioned in some of the notes that we had shared discussions of micro and macro trauma. Could you explain what you mean by that and how you see that in her work?
Yeah, I mean, just as like Ronell was talking about, like she's a superhero, so there's going to be some sort of past trauma that fuels their need to be a superhero to begin with, right? But again, I'm thinking because Eve Ewing is who she is, from a generational aspect, from the fact that she's a black woman, like she's coming at it from a completely different perspective. Even something as simple as, and I'm going to get to the micro and macro in a second, but even something as simple as like, the AI that's in Ironheart isn't like this like sort of ego-driven sort of AI that comes from Tony Stark, right? She creates, while it's a painful acronym, she creates Natalie, right, who is her best friend, and she creates her solely for the purpose of keeping her in check, right? Like her whole idea of an AI is saying, what are the things that I could succumb to? What are my weaknesses? And who's the person from my past that could keep me in check from those things, right? Which kind of the opposite end of Tony Stark to a certain extent, at least early on, before they started, having a more well-developed Tony Stark. From the micro and macro, that Natalie is part of that micro trauma, right? It's the individual trauma that Ironheart's bringing to this persona, this superhero she is. And because of that violent past in which she lost multiple people to gun violence in Chicago, she approaches being a superhero in a very different way. It's very strategic. She's looking for the best way to sort of solve the issue without destroying cities and stuff like that. And from a macro perspective, when we're talking about Eve Ewing taking control of this character, as Ronell said, like nobody's going to say this is Bendis' character, is because from the get-go, she gets Ironheart talking in the first issue using Maya Angelou, right? Like that's her first quote. And not only is she using Maya Angelou, like she's using a poem, like Still I Rise, which is largely about one's ancestors and all that they have to overcome, right? And Riri, as a black woman, is not only dealing with her own micro trauma, right? Like she's dealing with the macro trauma from generations of being oppressed, of being looked at poorly, of not being considered a genius, of probably having heads turned when you end up in the halls of MIT. So like she's battling all these things, not only from her own personal trauma, but from the trauma of just being who she is on a larger scale in America and from Chicago.
When I read the her issues, like the storyline, there's a lot of people that are novelists or other writers that don't transition well into comics. It's it's its own thing, right? I am always super impressed by the layers of stories, and even like she's built in from the beginning stories that are going to evolve and grow over the life of this character. And so I don't know if you can talk a little bit about maybe how you see Ewing doing that, and how successful she's been.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of evident in the fact that they've given her the keys to the kingdom as far as it goes with these younger characters, right? Like, she has this book. She wrote the that Miss Marvel team up book, which was really cool, and then she's also taken over Champions, right? And like, I don't know if you remember this, Adon, but like one of the things that really kind of burned me up about the Champions book, which made me kind of jump off. I'm not denigrating the other writers. It's fine. Which that wasn't Al Ewing, was it? Because that'd be weird. But the initial writer of that book, the one thing that bugged me the most was he would have them things that always came across, like say things that always came across like, "Hello, fellow teenagers." You know what I mean? Like it's always this weird, like you don't speak the language, man. Don't try it. Just write them some other kind of way or something. But like, I think they recognize that, right? And she's also writing like this Outlawed event series, which again, if you know anything about the way Big Two comics work, at least, you don't give somebody that architecture role unless you completely trust them with that, right? And she's getting to like build this entire world. I think that speaks to her skill and like her ability to speak the language of comics. It's one of those weird things, right? Adon brought up the idea of Riri being this kind of avatar in a lot of ways of like black women who have to deal with the macro and micro, traumas, right? And I think that through Ewing's work, as a sociology professor, as this poet, as someone who, walks the talk, I think that lends itself to her work. So she's in a place where she can talk about superheroism and the reality of actually having to live in your space or live in this world in the space that you occupy as a young Muslim girl, as a young black girl, as a young Afro-Latinx male. All those are things I think that she is more invested in than some of the other writers might be. And it's just as a result of living in that other a lot more than some people haven't had the opportunity or willingness to do. So when you read her stuff, it's like, again, it just lands. Like it's funny how real stories can work as superhero stories.
I want to give Adon a chance if there's anything you want to add into that.
Oh no, I mean, I guess I was going to say in terms of like how, like she's sort of bringing her sort of like background and taking hold of these stories. I think Randall touched about, and he talked about it earlier when he said like she's about kids, man. So like that's why it just makes sense that she takes on that Champions book and those characters and that storyline, because everything that she's done professionally and even the content of most of her collections, even if you look at 1919, which is largely about looking back at history, but it's largely also to analyze and reflect on history and how it's impacting the present, how it's impacting these kids today in our neighborhoods, in our school systems. She wrote an entire book about that from a sociological, perspective. And she's just the right person to take on those characters and that story. And again, I think that authenticity of not only who she is, where she's coming from, and the care that she brings to it, but just the fact that she can write in that language that just makes it not only more enjoyable, but like Ronell said, just more authentic. So yeah, that's all I would say about those other stories that she's doing.
Could we talk a little bit more about some of the other titles that you've mentioned, just to make sure that people who are listening that may not be familiar maybe get a little preview, and if Ironheart doesn't sound like the direction they want to go, maybe they want to jump into Champions or some of the other works.
Sure, and these are relatively new, but do you want to jump right now? Jump on.
Yeah, I mean, the one that to me felt the least Eve Ewing, but the most. And I'm looking to the side because I have another monitor that has like the other books on it. The Miss Marvel team up book, which is just straight up like a comic, right? Like it's straight up like this. We're taking this Miss Marvel character, and she's teaming up with Peter Parker and Carol Danvers, and I feel like she might get to Spider-Man, but I can't. Miles Morales, Spider-Man, I can't remember. I only read those first two, but it's just fun and like the humor that she brings into those two. The Peter Parker one is a body switch story. So if you're like me, and I suspect this of her too, and you grew up in a time when there were no less than 4 body swap movies when we were kids. That is a genre of fiction that you're like, oh, I dig this. I can dig into this, right? And she plays with all those jokes, and it's just fun the way that she embodies that. She, I think, has this way of finding not only her own voice, but mimicking the voice of those well-established characters and bringing them into her fold and kind of making them play by her rules, which is really like interesting, I think. And then Outlawed is the new series that's coming up / it's kind of like leaning into something right now. So it's talking about this world where they're going to outlaw teen heroes. I mean, I've only basically barely started that book, but I feel like knowing who she is and knowing what Ewing's voice is, there's some really interesting social commentary that can come out of that, and the idea of like looking at where we are currently and the role that the youth are playing in changing our actual world right now. To talk about a world in the comics where they're talking about limiting youth access to being able to affect change, I think this is an easy home run for her to knock out of the park. Like you can kind of see where she might go, but I'm interested to see how she takes this.
And this has got it's got some like dual layers here too, because she does focus heavily on just the idea and the concept of invisibility. You know, with Ironheart from not only from like an ethnic cultural perspective, but also from a generational one, and she's really, you know, diving headfirst into that with this Outlawed like event series type thing, because like I said, like Ronell said, these are essentially teen superheroes who are saying you can't do this, and you can't do this because we care about you, and we don't want you to get hurt, right? So there's very like manipulative and malicious sort of idea going on here with just limiting people's powers and essentially like infantilizing them from their ability to have any sort of agency. And I think for just teaching high school students, I know that they often feel that way, and we often just as educators and as people who are the head of institutions, you know, do that to them in various ways. Sometimes, you know, consciously, sometimes not. So it's I'm looking forward to this series and this storyline in general.
It's really interesting when you look at like these new characters, right? Or these characters that are old that have been kind of repurposed. Like you look at a Squirrel Girl, you look at Miss Marvel, you look at Spider-Man, Miss Nova to a certain extent, and you look at like Amadeus Cho, right? And you look at all these characters who are young, and the writers are approaching what they've done in a way where it's like it's all about challenging status quo. It's never been about coming in and like just beating people up. Or if I have to resort to that form of superheroism, I have to constantly be mindful of this idea of what are the repercussions of my action, right? Like Miss Marvel is all about protecting Jersey City, and it's hurt when it feels like what her actions have led to something that harmed Jersey City, right? Eve Ewing is territorial. Riri is territorial about Chicago and is all about acting locally. As well as acting globally to impact that, right? And then you look at a Squirrel Girl who all of her stuff is about like, I'm unbeatable, but why would I want to fight you? I'd rather figure out how to make friends with you or how to like each channel some of the aggression you have, right? I think it speaks to, again, these new voices that they're bringing in that are saying, we have people who are going to learn from these books, and why should we make them learn that punching somebody is the first thing you need to do to solve your problems, right? And I just think it's cool that those are the voices that are being elevated right now.
It's all genres kind of go through their reinventions, and maybe this is the start of a new reinvention for comics. Maybe.
Well, I think it is.
It might be.
At some point, we went through this, like a reinvention where it was like, oh, we're just going to give you these dour, sad adult comic books. Right. And the argument was always like, why aren't these made for kids anymore, right? And I think you're starting to see that transition back to like, yeah, no, like we should make them for kids, and we should be very cognizant of what we're placing in front of them. So it's nice.
Like Ronell's description of this is a fun book. That's not something you're saying about like Frank Miller's Batman, right? Like,
yeah, exactly, yeah. And so much that came after it, right? It was just like,
it's played itself out. So
yes,
I think we've touched on this a little bit, but just to ask the question and make sure, just a little bit more, like what does EViewing bring to comics that others don't? Just if there's anything further that we should touch on.
Again, I would say that just like her background in sort of being very conscious about those like social aspects, and then how they end up manifesting themselves in just little things, right? So there's again a scene in the first like volume of Lionheart, maybe in the first issue, in which like the people from MIT or the college comes in into her lab, and they're like, hey, showing everybody around because they have to have investors and people who are going to write money to them, and she's showing them like the different stuff that she's working on, and like one of them is like forensic visors, right? And like probably not the thing that's like the sexiest thing to show like in a comic book, right? If you're working on these things, like where's the blasters and stuff like that, right? She's like forensic visors, and she talks about how how they can like detect any sort of like DNA and blood pattern and all that stuff. So a lot of people might be like, oh, who cares? But like to somebody who's a sociologist and coming where she comes from, like that's a big deal given how many people have been wrongly imprisoned for poorly gathered evidence, for people who have had to take plea deals due to poorly gathered evidence, and all these things of just people from the community that have had to deal with this issue, right? So just to have something like forensic visors, which again is, I'm sure, a very cognizant thing on her part. I don't think she's just like, what's a cool thing to do? Forensic visors, right? Like it's a very conscious decision on her part to do that, right? And then there's like, and then she shifts over to like the suit and she says like it's a suit that can withstand infinite amount of pressure, right? And it's cool because she talks about going deep down into the ocean with it. But it's, you can't also ignore the fact that it's also a metaphor, right? Like here's Riri Williams stepping into this suit that has to be able to take this infinite amount of pressure from all the fanboys and all the other individuals who Ronell alluded to that I didn't know, or actually said specifically, were complaining about her taking over this book, right? And not only her taking over this book, but Riri stepping into this Iron Man, this Iron Man like position, even though Iron Man still exists. So I don't understand what's the issue. But just like just the fact that this other character, right, this young black girl is now an Iron Man equivalent, bothers some people for insane reasons. So just this idea that that the suit has to be able to withstand immense amounts of pressure. So I think there's just little things like that that's very literary and very conscious from a sociological standpoint, and she does it throughout. I hope at some point we can just talk about just the motto or the mantra that becomes Riri's thing, because I think even that stands in stark contrast to Peter Parker's, which may have to do with, as Ronell said, some of these books are 50, 60 years old, right? And their characters' inceptions are decades old. But also just, again, the author who's writing it is also bringing a very different perspective. I kind of ran on a little bit there, so Ronell, if you want to jump in, sorry.
No, I did want to extend that metaphor a little bit. The skin that she's stepping into, or the skin that she's in, right? There's this duality to that, because then there's also the idea of the strong black woman trope that she's playing with, and this idea that she feels like she has to be strong, she has to do this on her own, and she has to fight the world basically by herself and solve all these problems. And again, that's a perspective that only someone who lives that reality could address, right? Because then she has, Riri do things that might be more healthy for her, like going to a lost support group with her mom, or even giving her the role model of her mother or her stepfather, who talked a lot about how important it was to own the things that you dream about, right? So like the stuff that, again, I've never seen approached in this medium before. And I don't want people to like get mixed up. Like this isn't a book that's just like a protest book, right? Like it's not. That's not. Right. This is a comic at the end of the day. She fights, villains, blows stuff up, flies around the sea. She does Iron Man stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's just that you have this really smart and nuanced person writing it and understanding that all literature should have some meaning underneath it. And even like a Stan understood that. It's just that there's more nuance to what, Eve Ewing bringing to the table, I think, than anybody else can do.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's a lot of different ways you could read the comic, right? It's definitely fun. Like you said, it's fun. It's a straight up superhero story, but they're also like it's not in your face, like the "Still I Rise" quote, right? If you didn't know what that was, and it's in quotes, so it's like it's not on accident, right? That's there on purpose. Mm-hmm. It's there with meaning, and you could go track down what that meant. But if you didn't know what it meant and you didn't catch it, it doesn't ruin the story. Like it doesn't, like the whole thing doesn't hinge on you getting some reference that maybe you don't know. So you can find a lot of different access points to appreciate and get this. And so.
There's also just fun like pop culture stuff in there, right? Like they're having like conversations about shows, and they have the hip hop debate, and he's complaining like, "How's Jay-Z not in your top 5?" And then she chastises him for not loving like A Tribe Called Quest. So, like there's just fun things in there that don't require this sort of deep analysis, but they're there for you if you want it, which is nice.
Right. Absolutely. Did you want to talk more, Don, about the motto and mantra? You mentioned it and brought up with great power, but because
I just think with great power comes great responsibility. Is great. I love that mantra. I love that motto. It's endured for a reason, right? Like it's broad enough and just like altruistic enough, I guess, to a certain degree to just enjoy. But in hers, and it comes, I believe, and I don't want to ruin this. Ron, maybe help me out if you can remember. But this, I think, comes from her stepfather, which you talked about how he plays a significant role in her life. But he says, like, I'm pretty sure it comes from him, but she says, like, those who move with courage make the path for those who live in fear, right? And that essentially ends up being, the sort of thing she comes back to over and over as she sort of embraces this role as a superhero. And I think that's quite a bit different from with great power comes great responsibility, which is great, but it's sort of, she's saying, it's got that sort of same idea, right? That like you have a responsibility as somebody who, who's been given this gift. In her case, it's this gift of genius. But there's also those that's like, you don't only have the responsibility to act and to protect these individuals, but you have a responsibility to move them, to inspire them, right? That when you move with courage, when you show people that you can sort of achieve the things you never thought you could, that you could do the right thing when everybody else is telling you to do the wrong thing, when everybody else is doing it, you make that way for individuals to go ahead and do the same thing for themselves. So it's not only just saying that you have to do the right thing as somebody with great power. It's saying as somebody with great power, you have to inspire others to do the right thing as well. And I think that's taking it to that next level, which I think is Eve Ewing does nothing by accident, right? She's far too intelligent to make any sort of just happy accidents, right? So like, and she does this in her poetry as well, right? She's constantly going back towards these like, these individuals, and I know I can't think of what poem it's from, but I remember it's from Electric Arches because it's kind of stuck with me, and it's an Assata Shakur quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but it says like essentially like black revolutionaries like aren't dropped from the moon, right? Like they're created through what they've endured, right? Or like through the conditions, through the context of who they are. And again, I'm paraphrasing there. So she obviously says it a lot more tact and a lot more poetically. But like, that's a huge part of this character, right? And again, that's a huge part of all heroes. All heroes, like Ronell said right in the beginning, has this trauma, have this history, have the death of a beloved family member or something equivalent to it that fuel who they are. But I don't think it's ever been, or at least not as often, had this sort of take where it's like, not only are you taking all this history and this trauma, again, from a micro and macro perspective, but you're using it not just to fuel the kind of hero you're going to be, but the kind of influence you're going to have on those people around you as well.
It's almost like this community empowerment kind of philosophy at the heart of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like I can be the hero and I can be out in front, but I know who's behind me. I know who's with me, right? Like, and I think that connects so well with readers. And you talk about empowering, especially like high school kids now that may not see themselves always in pop culture. It's kind of a nice way to pull people in. So, do we want to talk a little bit about some of her other works? I know you've already mentioned some, and we obviously mentioned 1919. There's any other things that you want to point out or think that our listeners should hunt down?
Yeah, I mean, if you are, one of those people who is maybe tired of hearing people use "What About Chicago" as like a cudgel to beat you over the head with, I definitely say check out her book about education, Ghost in the Schoolyard. I think it's a very in-depth exploration of some of the ways that as a city we have chosen to use our resources, and that might explain and maybe humanize the people that folks outside of here have a tendency to dehumanize. I would also say again, like, we can't speak about her comics without speaking about her poetry. So yeah, Electric Arches is an easy go out and buy like immediately. Again, every time I read her poetry, I'm always like transported to being like that high school kid who was riding the bus, through the neighborhoods, and just like you see someone at every given point in her poetry, even if you aren't from here. So I say definitely check that out. But I mean, you honestly should be reading Ironheart. Like that's just bottom line. And I don't know, has this book ended? Because I know they have like this big omnibus coming out soon that collects like all of it. I know that Iron Man 2020 came out too, and she was a part of that. But I think this is a book you need to read if you are at all interested in, maybe opening your mind about, where stuff could go. Recently we lost Chadwick Boseman, and there's a lot of talk about like what can we do with this, this key player gone out of the Marvel universe, and you have Tony or Robert Downey Jr. has left. And I think for those of us who are reading books like Shuri and Ironheart, you can think about this a lot more creatively than some people are. Like, we're not thinking, go out and get Daniel Craig. You know what I mean? Like, we're like, nah, you can put these girls in and they would kill this.
Yeah. Miss Marvel, like where's Miss Marvel and all of this, right?
Yeah, for
sure.
So I think if you are open to it, like you have an opportunity to, I think more creatively, and it's always just a good idea to open your mind up to this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a lot to add to what Ronell just said. Check out her poetry collections. Electric Arches is a favorite of mine. We take a look at a lot of poems from there just in school. 1919 is just an incredible work that I think could have been like really difficult in the hands of somebody else, but she handles it with such grace and such beauty, even to that point where she has like I said, one thing that struck me when I was reading that collection was just the she has one title with like, there is no poem for this, right? In which she just gives the straight account of one of the reports from the 1919 report, and it just tells you just the horrific nature of what was happening, and she does not feel compelled to say like, I'm going to write about this. She just says, I'm going to give you verbatim what's in this report because you should read this. And she understood that at that point, there's no inspiration or translation that I need to do at this point. Just read what's in there, because that alone speaks volumes, right? So like I think she just handles this stuff very, very carefully. Even like and I'm not sure if this is in one of her collections, but I love this poem, which is I saw Emmett Till at the grocery store, right? And it's just it's just this poem that has like, here you are dealing with something that's just horrific and traumatic and still is very painful to many people, and yet she's handling it in this way, and through discussing something as horrific as what happened to Emmett Till, she's able to talk about this man at the grocery store and how he's handling the peaches. I think it's the peaches, might be plums. How he's handling the fruit, and how just the way he's handling it, sort of working as a metaphor for how the world handles these young black men, right? And it's just like, Jesus, man, like it's just, she's just read her stuff, man. That's all I can say. Yes. Read her stuff and read Ironheart, because like everyone was saying, it's just a brilliant piece of. It's just a brilliant comic book, period. Take away all the things that we were just talking about, and Troy, you mentioned that. It's just a good, fun comic book. That's it. But then you also get all the other layers that if you want it, it's there, and it just makes it that much more enriching. So,
I think one of the great things with hero stories is that life always is going to, no matter what, like we might not be flying around with our own Iron Man armor, but there will be challenges that we have to face, right? And that we have to be the hero of our own lives, kind of like to steal from Joseph Conrad a little bit, right? That at some point you've got to step up and be a hero. And I feel like the great thing with her writing, I think this comes through in 1919, I think it comes through in Ironheart, is that she does it in a way that empowers, where you can feel like a normal person and still feel like a hero, right? I think that's a hard thing to do, which, to go back to what we said earlier, isn't what you get when you read like the old, brooding, tough Batman. Like that's that's not an everyday person. That's a billionaire who bought his own Batmobile, whatever, right? Like this is like the kind of the grace and charm that I think Ewing brings to these hero stories for sure. So, and if there's any other closing comments you want to make, if not, I appreciate your time, and I'll just thank you both.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that the last thing I do want to kind of point out, Adon hinted at this, we are a part of a collective of teachers called LitX that explores and encourages ways to, incorporate pop culture into your classroom and into education. I think while that's our push, I think that even those of you at home who aren't educators, I think this is a time now where you can start to look around you and say that, pop culture doesn't have to be an escape. It can be a tool and or opportunity to learn more about the world around you and to learn more about things that maybe you weren't as informed about. 1919 is a great example of that. But I mean, even listening to like a Kendrick Lamar would be the same thing that kind of allows you to explore something outside of your own world. So, we're going to be starting up a lot more, even like this, partnering with folks like Troy to talk about, ways to use pop culture in your life as a way to, edify yourself. And I encourage you to go out and do even more of that, even without myself.
100%. I know in our library we like the great works, but we know that the real stories we read are things like comic books and the movies we watch and the music we listen to. So thank you for your work, and I thank you both for your time. And we will definitely bring you, when we get back to normal life, we'll bring you into the library to do this in person. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, man. Appreciate it.
Can't wait.